Li Bai, and Taoist poetry. Let's start with a review. Now, in the last 2 weeks, you've learned about religious versions of Daoism. First, we started with the ancient Daoism of the Celestial Masters, as well as of the Shangqing and Lingbao sects. Then, from Professor DiBernardi's guest lecture, we heard more about contemporary Taoist religious practice. For today, you had to read several poems by the great Tang poet Li Bai. Because Li Bai is strongly associated with Daoism, we will spend time today thinking about how his poetry reflects religious Taoist ideals, as these were understood during the Tang dynasty. Our goal is to show how Taoist ideas and imagery provided an important set of materials for Li Bai to work with, but also how he created poetry which was more than just a collection of Taoist doctrines. Now, of course, Li Bai was not the first Taoist poet. Poetry has always been part of the Taoist tradition. When we were talking about the Dao De Jing in the beginning of the class, we already mentioned that the text itself has rhyming verse passages, probably intended to assist oral memorization of some of the main ideas of the text. There are also portions of the Zhuangzi which include rhymed verse as well. And early Taoist religious movements from the end of the Han Dynasty also incorporated verse as part of their revealed scriptures, especially in the Shangqing revelations first passed down through Yangxi. Later, under the influence of Buddhist gathas, or jizi, intended as simple poems used to teach doctrine to commoners, Taoist religious sects also developed their own gathas, simple poems intended to teach the basics of doctrine for popular religious use. Elite writers in the early medieval period also were influenced by Taoism in differing ways. Tao Yuanming is famous for invoking Taoist ideas in describing his life as a literary recluse, while other poets such as Ji Kang and Ruanji used poetry to explain their attachment to an elite philosophical Taoist movement of the 3rd century AD known as obscure learning, or xuanxue. However, when we talk about Taoism and poetry, if we have to choose one poet, we might as well choose Li Bai, both because he had a historical, real attachment to Taoism, but also because he's so famous and so central to the Chinese poetic tradition. So Li Bai, who lived in the middle of the 8th century, is probably the most famous poet in Chinese literary history. Li Bai is also strongly associated with Taoism in the popular literary imagination. He's sometimes called the poet immortal, or shi xian, indicating his resemblance to a kind of Taoist demigod. And usually people think of Li Bai as Taoist because the style of his poetry is carefree, ecstatic, imaginative, and romantic, celebrating spontaneity, all values which are also associated in a very common sense with Taoism. Now, many of you who grew up in China were probably made to memorize Li Bai's most famous poem about looking at the moon and thinking of home. 床前明月光，疑是地上霜。举头望明月，低头思故乡。 Or in English, before the bed there is the light of the bright moon. I suspect that it is frost on the ground. I look up towards the bright moon, and I lower my head and I think of home. Now, as Li Bai's poems go, that actually isn't a great one. It's primarily famous because it's short and easy enough to make little kids memorize it, and I think maybe many of you in the class, by the time you reached nursery school, you were already being made to memorize that poem. But Li Bai does have dozens and dozens of poems which are really among the best written in the Chinese language. In fact, Li Bai had more real connection to Daoism than just the vague stylistic characteristics of his poetry mentioned in the last slide, such as that it's carefree and imaginative and romantic and so on. During his 20s and 30s, Li Bai was actually a protege of the most famous Taoist priest of the Tang Dynasty, a man called Sima Changzhen. Sima is now, if he's remembered at all, he's mostly remembered for writing a book of meditation called the Treatise on Sitting and Forgetting, or 坐忘论. But actually, he was the 12th patriarch of the Shangqing school, roughly equivalent to like the Pope of the Shangqing religion. So he was arguably the most important religious figure in the Tang Dynasty, or one of the most important. Later, after Sima's death in 744, Li Bai actually joined an initiation ritual into the Shangqing, which gave him a religious status equivalent to that of a professional Taoist priest. And as a result, Li Bai had a deep knowledge of Taoist religious texts, and scholars have found in his poetry many references to Shangqing scriptures. Such allusions are one element in his poetic style, which make it seem otherworldly at times. In the reading for today, you are not assigned any poems by Li Bai which exhibit the very closest relationship to the Shangqing Taoist scriptures and to Li Bai's own religious practice. Those poems are fascinating, but understanding them would require a highly technical knowledge of Shangqing doctrine during the Tang Dynasty, and we just don't have the time or space in this class to go over those. So instead, we'll focus on some of Li Bai's poems which are easier to understand, but which also exhibit important Taoist influence in various ways. There are references to Taoist texts. There is the use of Taoist imagery, and there is the expression of Taoist ideals, which we will find throughout these poems. In a minute, I will be leading you through several slides with some of Li Bai's poems from the assigned readings, and demonstrating for you how we can read these poems to understand the very different ways in which Taoism appears in his work. During our class this week, you will be asked to read some of his other poems in the same way, so it is important that you have a basic understanding of how to approach interpretation of these materials. Those of you who grew up in Canada probably didn't read much poetry at all in high school, and the poetry you did read was likely all English language poetry. So it is important to remember that Li Bai's poems don't behave like those which you may have seen before. The way to read a Chinese poem is very different than the way to read an English poem, because classical Chinese poetry starts from very different assumptions than poems written in European languages. The Western tradition originally understood poetry to be a kind of art, and hence poems are generally assumed to be something carefully constructed to bring out the beauty of language. In contrast, classical Chinese poems were usually composed under the assumption that a poem should be a direct response to an immediate stimulus on the poet. Poems are almost always assumed to be in the first-person voice, even though one often won't see the word I used in the original Chinese version. And if you see a scene described, like a natural scene of nature, trees, and so on, your assumption should be that the poet wants us to think that that is what he is seeing at the very moment that he is composing the poem. Therefore, as we are reading these poems together, please don't focus on hunting for symbols which express abstract philosophical ideas, as you might have done in high school English class. Instead, try to remember that all the images in these poems should be considered as meaning something within the context of an individual moment which the poet is directly experiencing. Allusions to Taoist texts take their meaning from the way in which those texts are understood by participants in the culture, and the specific circumstances in which Li Bai is invoking them in the story which each poem is presenting. Let's start with an easy one, which in English is titled Ancient Song, or which in Chinese is the 9th of the series of 59 poems in the Gufeng series. Now, this poem is relatively straightforward in Chinese. The title, calling this an ancient song, indicates that it's modeled after an older form of simple oral poetry. And it's meant to seem, to readers in the Tang Dynasty, to feel fairly direct, very song-like. And in this case, the poem is also expressing what Li Bai considers an ancient wisdom. Zhuangzi dreams he's a butterfly, and a butterfly becomes Zhuangzi. All transformation, this one body. Boundless occurrence goes on and on. It's no surprise eastern seas become western streams, shallow and clear, or the melon grower at Qing Gate once reigned as Duke of Dongling. Are hopes and dreams any different? We bustle around, looking for what? So, with this poem, we start in the first lines with the famous story of the butterfly dream in Zhuangzi. But notice that Li Bai is changing it. The original story is about Zhuangzi dreaming he is a butterfly, and then when he wakes, not knowing if he is a human or just a butterfly dreaming of being a human. It's a question of how do you really know anything. But the way Li Bai is using the story, it's not about knowledge, it's about change, as if Zhuangzhou really were constantly changing back and forth between being a human and a butterfly. This is a version of the story which has been seriously influenced by the focus on change and transformation, which is common in the rest of the Zhuangzi, even if it wasn't originally part of the butterfly story. It may also owe something to Buddhist ideas of reincarnation. Look at the third couplet about eastern seas evaporating and turning into rain in the streams which flow downward again. The Chinese original talks of Penglai waters, not eastern seas. Penglai, though, is a group of islands in the Pacific Ocean, which are legendary as home of Taoist immortal beings. There is also a long-standing poetic tradition of talking about the ending of life as a river running out into the ocean. So in this case, water returning from Penglai, the land of the immortals, to clear inland streams suggests a process of endless death and rebirth. The allusion to the Duke of Dongling growing melons is not specifically Taoist. It's a story of a great aristocrat and minister of state during the Qin dynasty, who after the fall of the Qin spent the rest of his life contentedly growing melons outside the city gates. It's an allusion which again suggests the inability to escape change in life, and the fact that one cannot rely on having wealth and power. So, overall, this poem presents us with a clear example of one very basic kind of Taoist poem. That is, a poem which focuses on explicating a few common, even stereotypical Taoist themes. In this case, the importance of ceaseless change in the universe and the impossibility of holding on to wealth and power. There are also Taoist images used, such as Zhuangzhou's butterfly dream and the island of Penglai, but these aren't being used in a careful way to reflect their original meaning. Instead, they are used loosely and reinterpreted to reinforce the overall impression of the Taoist theme of constant change. Let's move on to the next poem, the title of which has been translated into English for you as Morning Zhao, or which in Chinese is Ku Zhao Qingheng. Here we have a very short poem of 4 lines, composed upon a specific occasion. Poetry was often written to mark the incidents in one's life, sometimes sent to friends as letters, often conceived as just a normal way of communicating or noting something important, like writing a note in a diary. Poetry was a social practice. In this case, Li Bai was mourning what he thought to be the death of a Japanese friend named Abe no Nakamaro, or known in Chinese as Zhao Heng. Now, Abe was part of a Japanese diplomatic mission to the Tang Dynasty court. However, after that mission was over, he actually stayed behind as a student, and then he actually took and passed the imperial examination. And later he was made the governor of a province of South China, which includes part of what we now call Vietnam, which was then under the Tang imperial control. Eventually, after his period as governor, Abe returned to Japan, but en route his ship was wrecked and sunk. Abe himself actually survived, but this poem of Li Bai's was written at a time when Li Bai had thought that Abe actually died in the shipwreck. So let's read it together. Zhao left our imperial city for his homeland, a lone flake of sail. Now he wanders islands of immortals. Foundering in emerald seas, a bright moon never to return, leaves white, grief-tinged clouds crowding our southlands. Now, in no way is this a poem meant to teach Taoist doctrine. It isn't even about the vague Taoist theme of change that we saw in the last poem. Instead, this poem is an example of the way that Taoist imagery might be used casually toward the purposes of social or occasional poetry, such as, in this case, mourning the death of a friend. In the first couplet, notice that we get back the same image of the islands of the immortals that we had in the last poem. Here in Chinese, the name is given as Penghu rather than Penglai, but it's the same imaginary place. It's a legendary set of islands somewhere out in the Pacific where the Taoist demigods are supposed to live. Within this poem, this is used as an ironic parallel to Japan. Zhao was trying to sail home to one set of real physical islands. Instead, he sailed into the mythical islands of the afterlife, also thought to be somewhere in the Pacific Ocean. Now, the third line suffers from a bad translation here, unfortunately. The meaning of the Chinese is, "A bright moon does not return to sink into emerald green waters." The moon, of course, like the sun, always rises in the east and sets in the west. From China, this means that the moon should be rising up out of the Pacific, not sinking into it. Here, Zhao is being compared to a bright moon who could never return home to Japan, though he literally did, as Li Bai thought, sink beneath the waves. The line is asserting, in fact, that there is no real sinking. That is, he didn't really drown. Instead, he must have become an immortal demigod. And the final line, with its reference to the sad clouds over the south, is specifically using a place name, Cangwu, referring to the region which included both northern Vietnam and modern Guangxi province, where Zhao had been the governor. The idea is that as he ascended to heaven, the province he had governed was in grief for him because he had been such a good governor. So what we have here is not a Taoist poem in the sense that it's deliberately trying to teach Taoist doctrine or Taoist ideals. Instead, this is a poem which appropriates common Taoist imagery about the afterlife and the islands of the immortals to make a very appropriate and touching tribute poem for a friend. This kind of imagery is commonly known by readers during the Tang Dynasty, so it's very easy for Li Bai to use it in this casual way for a purpose other than something explicitly religious. And also, we should say, both in the Tang Dynasty and afterwards, there are plenty of poets who themselves are not committed to Taoism in the same way Li Bai was, but who also might occasionally make use of this common stock of Taoist imagery in order to express something personal about their own lives or their friends' lives. And that's, in a very loose way, another kind of Taoist poem, or a way in which at least Taoism has influenced the poetic tradition. Let's move on and talk about one last poem. This is the poem Looking for Yong, the Recluse Master. Now here we have a poem that tends to balance out the different kinds of elements that we saw in the prior couple of examples. We have a poem which was also written on a specific occasion, but which was also now tied to Taoist religious practice, and which relies on some common themes, which I think you'll remember from the Dao De Jing and the Zhuangzi. So let's take all of these elements and put them together as we read this poem. Emerald peaks polish heaven. I wander, sweeping clouds away, forgetting years. Looking for the ancient way. Resting against a tree, I listen to stream water. Black ox dozing among warm blossoms. White crane asleep in towering pines. A voice calls through the river-tinted dusk. But I've descended into cool mist alone. Here, the first line of the poem sets the scene. Li Bai mentions these peaks which are polishing or scraping the sky to let us know that that's where he physically is, up among those mountains. Now, obviously, this means that he must have left behind the city and the comforts of home. The first words of the next line, I wander, are in Chinese, 逍遥, which is a word which is first used in the tradition in the title of the very first book of the Zhuangzi, 逍遥游. So immediately, with this initial couplet, we are reminded of the Zhuangzi and put in the frame of mind of a kind of Taoist wandering, up in the mountains where one is so far from civilization that one can even forget which year it is. 逍遥不纪年. I wander forgetting years. Now this forgetting of years is also likely a reference to the story of Peach Blossom Spring, a mythical quasi-Taoist paradise first described by an earlier poet, Tao Yuanming, who, like Li Bai, is often associated with Taoism, and also with drinking too much. In any case, the first couplet sets the scene well and gives us a strong orientation to traditional Taoist themes and imagery. The next couplet tells us that Li Bai is looking for the ancient way. Now, this is a pun in Chinese, just as it is in English. Literally, Li Bai is trying to find an old trail through the mountains, which probably isn't marked very well. But also, obviously, he is seeking the ancient way, the Dao, by trying to visit this Taoist hermit, Yong, who is living in the mountains. The next line tells us that he pauses and listens to the stream. In the translation, he is leaning on a tree. The translator was actually using a slightly different edition of the poem than the Chinese one I used here, in which he's not leaning on a tree but on a rock. But regardless of what he's actually leaning on, we can deduce, because he needs to rest, that the road is probably pretty steep pretty tiring. And if it's that high, then he must be close to the source of the stream which he is listening to. And the Chinese word used for the stream here, quan, suggests actually the source of the spring, where the stream is emerging out of the ground. So Li Bai is getting near the source. And of course we can read this metaphorically. He's close to the yuanquan, or the source or origin of something important in life. In the next couplet, we're given a picture of what seems to be a simple, natural scene. There are oxen sleeping in a field. There are cranes roosting in pines. However, these are not random animals which Li Bai has chosen to describe here. In stories about Taoist mystical men, immortals, sages, and so on, oxen and cranes are actually these Taoist saints' most common modes of transport. There are lots of classical paintings which depict Taoist saints either riding on the back of cows or else even flying on the back of white cranes across the sky. So the fact that we now see here that oxen and cranes are resting should mean that Jung, the Taoist recluse, hasn't gone off roaming in the mountains somewhere. He should still be at home because his modes of transport are there resting. He hasn't ridden away on the ox. He hasn't ridden away on the cranes. So the recluse who Li Bai is looking for should be around here somewhere, and yet Li Bai can't see him. So the poem is posing a mystery to us. Where is the recluse master? Where did Jung go? The final couplet continues this mystery rather than resolving it. First, we have the sounds of speech coming to Li Bai through the dusk, though we aren't told what is being said or who is speaking. And we also don't know whether or not Li Bai himself knows who is speaking or what is being said. Maybe it's just someone's voice coming from far off, which he can't make out clearly. Then, in the last line, he goes down alone into the cold smoke or mist, which presumably means that he is traveling back down the mountain. And because it's so vague, it's possible to interpret this closing in almost opposite ways. Maybe someone behind Li Bai, who came up the mountain with him but is a bit slower, is calling him back. And then he has to turn around and go back toward the social world without ever having reached the recluse who can give him Taoist enlightenment, in which case the poem would seem to suggest his disappointment, the failure of his search. However, perhaps instead the voice is from in front of him. Maybe it's Jung, the Taoist recluse, himself calling out to welcome Li Bai. But Li Bai, for whatever reason, chooses not to meet him after his long journey and instead turns back. If so, why? Maybe he's scared. Maybe he has second thoughts about becoming a Taoist. Or perhaps, having reached the meadow where the animals are resting, maybe Li Bai has already found his own enlightenment as to the true nature of the world, and maybe he realizes he never needed Jung, the Taoist master, to give him instruction. However one wants to interpret this ending, it's clear that the poem depends thematically upon Li Bai's never actually meeting with the recluse Jung. That could be thought of as a sort of appropriate, vaguely Taoist ending, however one understands what actually happened. One should know that life has lots of unexpected twists and turns, and so one shouldn't rely on one's expectations coming to pass. So this poem is Taoist in a very balanced way. It is a poem written on a specific occasion, but it's an occasion with very clear Taoist overtones. And it's not intended to teach doctrine, but it does have clear Taoist themes, specific allusions to Zhuangzi, as well as to mythical stories of Taoist saints. And it wraps the whole thing up in a powerful narrative that remains open to interpretation, even while that openness gives us a kind of appropriate feeling, the feeling of the same lesson we got back when reading the Daoism, that sometimes one can't even get a firm answer to questions or put ideas into neat little categories. Now, notice that during the 3 poems I just discussed, I spent a lot of time discussing a few details in each poem. This is very important. In order to understand poetry, to really understand it, you need to be able to focus on every word and to figure out why a poet is saying certain things. It really isn't enough to just read through once and then come away with a general impression of how the poem makes you feel. Think about the way that I just analyzed these poems, and then go back and take another look at the other poems in your assigned reading for today. See if you can get a better understanding of them by examining them word for word and trying to decide why Li Bai chooses to write each line. Remember, we are going to be doing a reading exercise in class similar to the reading I've just done for you of these poems. So it would be a good idea to prepare yourself in advance to analyze and read closely all of the poems which were assigned for homework. In all of these poems, we have seen representations of events far removed from everyday experience. Remember, Daoism helps express countercultural ideals. However, these are poems which are very different, varied in style, difficulty, occasion, and purpose. So that even in the work of a single author, Li Bai, there isn't just one kind of Taoist poem. There are many different ways in which different kinds of poetry could be thought of as Taoist in different ways. What are the implications of this? Taoist ideas, images, and themes from Laozi and Zhuangzi, as well as other religious sects, permeate China's traditional culture. There are plenty of common associations with these materials, and because of that diversity, there's a great number of uses to which creative writers, artists, and thinkers put these materials. So in order to interpret Taoist influences on Chinese culture correctly, one must both understand the source materials, but also allow for innovation and transformation on the part of later creators of culture.